Today we're honored to have Lucas Morel as our speaker. His journey here across country through rain and snow and flight delays marks his dedication to political thought and to the principles we celebrate, civic education. And we really appreciate his efforts in coming here. Dr. Morel is the John K. Boardman Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University in Virginia, where he has taught since 1999. He's the author of Lincoln and the American Founding. Dr. Morel also edited 2 volumes on the 20th century fiction writer, Ralph Ellison. He currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quintennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. Today he'll draw threads from the 19th century, the 20th century, and the American founding together to discuss 2 models of patriotism, Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. Please join me in welcoming Lucas Morel.
Thank you, Will, SCETL, and y'all for coming out tonight to hear this. I wasn't flying the plane, but all's well that ends well. I'm here to speak about 2 great American patriots, Frederick Douglass and, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. They might seem an odd choice to discuss patriotism, as both men became famous by criticizing the land of their birth. While their criticisms of America have a lot in common, I think we will see a difference in their understanding of what the country of their birth owes them, owes all Americans, and therefore what each sought in terms of justice. I'm going to begin with Douglass. To say that he did not begin as a lover of America would be an understatement. He was born into slavery in Maryland, which he escaped from 20 years later. But it was an escape that did not secure his freedom in America because of a law passed in 1793 enforcing what was known as the Fugitive Slave Clause of the federal Constitution. In 1845, within months of publishing his most famous autobiography, the first of 3, I've published 0 autobiographies, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, within months, Douglass had to flee the United States because of his public notoriety. That notoriety made him liable to capture under the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. While abroad in the United Kingdom, Douglass wrote to his mentor and probably the most famous abolitionist in the United States, William Lloyd Garrison, "If ever I had any patriotism, it was whipped out of me long since by the lash of American soul drivers." After speaking on the abolition circuit for almost 2 years in England, Scotland, and Ireland, Douglass was able to return to the United States, but he could do so only safely after his legal manumission was purchased by friends both sides of the pond, 150 pounds sterling, about $700. Less than 2 months after his return in 1847 to the United States, he delivered a stem-winder of a speech titled, "The Right to Criticize American Institutions." He made clear where he stood on the question of patriotism. "I have no love for America. As such, I have no patriotism. I have no country." And then he asked, "What country have I? The institutions of this country do not know me, do not recognize me as a man." Those institutions were the major shapers of American life: the church, the government, the Constitution. Given that American slavery could not exist in the southern slaveholding states without the constitutional cooperation of the northern states, Douglass said of the federal government, "I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible. As for the Constitution, shivered into 1,000 fragments." Until 1849, Frederick Douglass could not love a country that did not love him. To his credit and America's, he did not hold that position for long. The seeds of his patriotism were sown, ironically enough, by the very country he originally despised. He eventually claimed America as his country, calling the principles of the Declaration of Independence saving principles, interpreting the Constitution as a glorious liberty document. He then devoted himself to getting white Americans, quote, to trust the operation of their own principles, end quote. As President Clinton said in his first inaugural address, our democracy must be not only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. That, I believe, was Douglas's patriotism in a nutshell. Douglas noticed a tremendous advantage that Black Americans had in their struggle for civil and political rights. Namely, white Americans at least claimed to believe in the principles of fairness and equality under the law. This belief was so strong that they wrote it into their most authoritative documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all there for everyone to see. Speaking for Black Americans, Douglas declared, all he asks now is that the nation shall fulfill toward him its own recognized and self-imposed obligations. So when Martin Luther King Jr. remarked, all we say to America is, be true to what you said on paper, he was channeling, I believe, the muse of Frederick Douglass. When King said, somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly, somewhere I read of the freedom of speech, somewhere I read of the freedom of the press, he drew attention to the same levers of freedom that Douglass saw as he lived among his oppressors, and they put it in writing. During Reconstruction, Douglass observed that the Constitution, quote, knows no distinction between citizens on account of color, end quote. He believed that the government of all should be partial to none. He concluded that, quote, the burden of our demand upon the American people shall simply be justice and fair play. We utterly repudiate all invidious distinctions, whether in our favor or against us. Only ask for a fair field and no favor. Douglass was not alone in his critical appreciation of America. In the face of pervasive racial bigotry, Africans on American soil and their descendants nevertheless became Americans. Denied the vote most of the time in most of the American colonies and then states, blacks still bought into the concept of government by consent of the governed as the only legitimate basis of government. Denied membership in most American churches most of the time, blacks still converted to the Christian faith. As Douglass put it, our hearts believed while they ached and bled. Blacks had taken America at her word. All men are created equal. And believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you shall be saved. They were intent on making a life for themselves and preparing a future for their posterity in the United States. After many 1,000 gone, if America was not the land of these black generations, what land could be? Douglass was unwilling to let their great labor and sacrifice go unappreciated and unrewarded. His ancestors for 270 years, Douglass declared, have lived and labored and died on American soil. Despite much of what white American legal and social practice that gave black Americans plenty of reasons not to love the land of their birth, Douglass placed great stock in how much blacks had contributed to the development of America, despite the inhospitable and ungrateful country. Therefore, black Americans could, he thought, look to an American past for a heritage to claim as their own, a country they could call theirs as well. They had a stake in making America live up to its noblest ideals and aspirations. Douglass's approach to fighting for American freedom can be seen in his 1845 narrative, where he describes his decision to resist a flogging at the hands of an overseer named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey seemed now to think he had me, could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know. I resolved to fight. Suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. Douglas called this the turning point of his career as a slave, when he resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglas commented that he had reached the point at which he was not afraid to die. This spirit made him, as he put it, a free man in fact, while he remained a slave in form. He took the measure of his oppressive circumstances, most especially his God-given freedom as a human being, determined not to remain simply a victim of his environment. For Douglas, freedom began within oneself, not with a change in one's circumstances. Each person must recognize and affirm his or her natural God-given right to his freedom. A favorite quote of his that encapsulated this mindset came from Lord Byron. Hereditary bondsmen, know ye that whoever would be free must himself first strike the blow. Douglas would pursue his own liberation and that of his fellow bondsmen, eventually making a career of reminding Americans that the principles of the Declaration apply to all human beings. Therefore, all Americans, regardless of race, deserve the equal protection of their common Constitution. Remarkably enough, the writings of slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson and Madison taught Douglas that the only relevant minority in America was the minority of one, the individual, whose natural and civil rights were the same as those of the political majority. In Douglas's words, color should not be a criterion of rights. A steadfast believer in equality under the law, he did not think race should be the measure of anyone's constitutional rights. Douglas believed, in fact, that an emphasis upon race was a losing proposition for black people in America. Instead of equal protection of the laws, Douglas declared, quote, "You lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens," end quote. He said that black Americans only ask to be allowed to do with ourselves, subject only to the same great laws for the welfare of human society, which apply to other men. So when he was asked the misbegotten, absurd question, what shall be done with the Negro, as it was said at that time, he answered, let us alone. Do nothing with us, for us, or by us as a particular class. Now, did Douglas really mean that black Americans should be let alone? Do nothing? He went on to explain. All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone, don't disturb him. You see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone, don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. In 1865, when Douglas gave this provocative answer, blacks were not given a chance to stand on their own legs. They were harassed, persecuted, even killed in their attempts to learn, to eat in a public place, to vote, to learn a trade. To be left alone, as Douglas insisted, did not mean to be left at the mercy of a racist mob. It meant to be protected by government, no more and no less than every other American citizen. This for him was true equality under the law, which is why the vote was so important to Douglas. To be freed from an individual legal master, but not allowed to vote, was simply to become what he called the slave of the community. He concluded, where universal suffrage is the rule, where that is the fundamental idea of the government, to rule us out is to make us an exception, to brand us with the stigma of inferiority, to invite to our heads the missiles of those about us. He gave many reasons why blacks should have the right to vote. But this concern for public opinion, what a ban against black voting rights taught the white majority regarding the humanity and the citizenship of blacks, therefore what they were owed or not by their government, was a long-standing priority for Douglas. Blacks were owed the vote because they were citizens. Granting this right would, as he put it, make the government entirely consistent with itself. On the other hand, anything that made blacks a special case in the public eye would undermine, he thought, their equality as American citizens and as human beings. This actually reinforced a white supremacy mindset. He did not see how the myth of white supremacy could be dispelled if blacks were exempted from the rules that applied to everyone else. With color prejudice as the great enemy of black progress in the United States, most of Douglas's efforts on behalf of civil and political rights were directed towards promoting policies that eliminated government distinctions based on race. Instead of living as an exception to the rules that applied to others, Douglas thought black Americans actually should integrate with the majority white population as much as possible. They should endeavor, as he put it, to make ourselves and be made by others a part of the American people in every sense of the word. Whites needed to recognize that their destiny was tied up with the destiny of blacks. And so Douglas encouraged blacks to avoid what we call today self-segregation. We should distribute ourselves among the people, build our houses, where if they take fire, other houses will be in danger. Common dangers will create common safeguards. Near the end of his life, he argued, it is better to regard ourselves as a part of the whole than as the whole of a part. Better to be a member of the great human family than a member of a particular variety of the human family. In regard to men as in regard to things, the whole is more than a part. And so, in his day, he exhorted blacks to become members and leaders of organizations and institutions that had been run by white people. They could then learn how these organizations and institutions operate, gain experience and skills, and best of all, work alongside whites, which would afford examples of character and competence on the part of blacks that would chip away at white prejudice. For Douglas, the way to eliminate racial bigotry was to become a part of the wholeness upon which America was founded. This led him to preach the principles of human equality and the rights of American citizenship. Here, let American history provide the lesson. If the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments required a black majority in Congress in order to pass, let alone to be ratified by the states, how secure would the rights of black Americans be? How much political progress would the nation have made if color, not citizenship, race, not humanity, characterized the political practice of America? Surely the progress Americans have made on this front had everything to do with the principle of equality taking hold over more and more Americans, most of whom were white. In 1954, there were no black justices on the Supreme Court that issued the unanimous 9-0 opinion, Brown v. Board of Education. In 1964, there were no black senators when the Civil Rights Act was passed. Ditto for the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Precious few black representatives in either case. Douglas, in his time, appreciated the labors of well-meaning white Americans over his many years of political activism, observing of famous white abolitionists. Neither Phillips, nor Sumner, nor Garrison, nor John Brown, nor Gerrit Smith was a black man. He added that no black man were ever truer to the black man's cause than these and other men like them. If white supremacy was immutable, none of these landmark advances in the laws and judicial decisions of the federal government would have occurred. In becoming an American and then speaking and writing for half a century on behalf of the equal rights of humanity and citizenship of black Americans, Douglas helped America become a better version of itself. He motivated black Americans to strive to improve themselves even before unjust barriers to their freedom were removed, challenged white America to conquer its prejudices, to rise to the dignity of its professions. To do so, Douglas called the nation back to its founding, the principles of the Declaration, the levers of freedom in the Constitution. These, he thought, were the surest guide to the equal protection of every American's civil and political rights. Now, our traditional understanding of King shares much with Douglas's understanding of the promise of America's founding principles and institutions. Exhibit A, as mentioned earlier, King's I Have a Dream speech, which justly ranks among the most famous speeches in American history. Delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, King's keynote address was heard by over 250,000 people gathered for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. King declared that the goals of the modern civil rights movement were simply to make real the promises of democracy. He found these promises in the Declaration and the Constitution. What he called a dream deeply rooted in the American dream was based upon a faith both biblical and constitutional, that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. With only 5 black men, serving in Congress, riots mounting that summer of 1963, the 34-year-old Baptist preacher had faith that the white American majority would do right by the Constitution and their consciences. This they did most notably by passing the Civil Rights Act the following summer, with President Lyndon Johnson signing it into law on July 2nd, 1964. Voting Rights Act came the following year. To be sure, a legislative full press by President and former Senate Majority Leader Johnson was instrumental to their passage. Johnson promoted these laws as a tribute to the slain President John F. Kennedy, who had called for a major civil rights bill in June 1963. Kennedy said it would address, quote, a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. He added, this nation will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. But it was King's televised speech, August 28, 1963, that kept what he called the citizenship rights of black Americans on the national agenda. This paved the way for the passage of serious civil rights legislation for the first time in almost 100 years. When King spoke the language of individual God-given rights, he found common ground for the nation's diverse citizenry to live in safety, pursue their happiness without jeopardizing any individual's opportunity to succeed through their own work and effort. Earlier that year, King had published his most famous essay, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. The King Americans are most familiar with is on full display, citing iconic political figures like Thomas Jefferson, slaveholder, and Abraham Lincoln, as well as Christian and Jewish thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Martin Luther, and Martin Buber, got to get him in, to say nothing of Jesus, Paul of the New Testament, and Amos of the Old Testament. King contrasted, on the other hand, Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam as a group of black Americans who, he said, had lost faith in America. The figures he praised, both political and religious, represented a constellation of influences that shaped America's social and political development for the better. He called this confluence of ideals the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage. He expressed a hope for the future because of what he found in our nation's past. Those great wells of democracy, as he put it, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In 1963, King found the clearest path forward for progress in civil and political rights for black Americans by looking to what had already been declared, constituted, put into operation by the efforts of blacks and whites, seconded, as he understood it, by the eternal will of God. King would repeat these odes to America's founding fathers and principles in later speeches. But unlike Frederick Douglass, King did not find these principles and institutions established at the founding sufficient for black progress in the United States. After that pivotal year of 1963, even as the landmark Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act took effect, he began to call more explicitly for a radical revisioning of American purpose and process. His model of American patriotism looked beyond what America had to offer to date. In his I Have a Dream speech, Freudian slip, King called the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, quote, a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. As far as her citizens of color are concerned, he said America had defaulted on that note. And speaking for the assembled multitude, he said they had come to the nation's capital to cash a check. He was speaking figuratively when he said that they should get upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. But it was not long before he would turn from figures of speech to arguments for policies that had everything to do with cashing a literal check. Only a year after his I Have a Dream speech, King expressed serious doubts that in his day, the principles of the Declaration, the mechanisms of the Constitution, even amended after the Civil War, and the goodwill of a majority white America would be sufficient. Even with the passage of landmark Civil Rights Acts, he believed something more, not just in terms of legislation, but in terms of new principles and structural changes would be necessary to bring about what he called the realization or fulfillment of equality. 60 years have passed since he delivered his most famous speech. No aspect of King's dream has provoked more controversy than his hope that his children would one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What could be controversial about a society where character, not skin color, dictated a person's prospects for success? The controversy arose over the role that color should play in creating a society where character is the only thing that should matter. In Why We Can't Wait, published in 1964, and especially Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, published in 1967, King proposed a national agenda that required something more than character building to enable blacks to prosper in America if color were no longer a barrier, even if the playing field were truly equal. So in what way does King's patriotism, his love for America, differ from Douglass? Oddly enough, it differs by the very thing one would think makes them the same. That is, their consistent harking back to the principles of the American founding. how can they both look at the same thing and ultimately, at least to some extent, draw somewhat different conclusions? The similarities lie in their expectation that what we said on paper, according to King, required that we be true to it. That means fundamentally equality under the law, the protection of the rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all the civil and political rights that belong to every American citizen. He called these citizenship rights to teach Americans the true meaning of civil rights. These weren't black rights, extra rights, special rights. These were the rights of citizens. The Constitution did not secure these rights on the basis of color, and therefore, as Frederick Douglass put it, color should not be the criterion of rights. Where they differed was that Douglass thought these protections in the Constitution, the rights spelled out and logically implied by the Declaration of Independence, were sufficient for black Americans to prosper in the land of their birth. What remained, if protected equally and thereby providing a level playing field, was up to each person. Douglass was confident that blacks would fare well if those things were true. That's why he focused on character, which was a fundamental part of education, at least back in the 19th century. That education not only included instruction of the mind, but also education of the heart, the formation of character. King made the importance of character ostensibly the hallmark of the American dream. That famous quote about his 4 little children, not being judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. It was his political analog to the saying, you can't judge a book, you ought not to judge a book by its cover. For America to live out the true meaning of its creed, the color line needed to be eliminated from American social and political practice. But why did I say King ostensibly made the judgment of persons according to character and not color the hallmark of American equality? It wasn't long after King said those words, on August 28, 1963, that he published those books, Why We Can't Wait, Where Do We Go From Here? And in those books, he calls for new policies that at minimum, but most ambitiously, especially in 1967, call for a new set of values. He used the term new sense of values and new set of values interchangeably. And he called for a restructuring of the whole of American society, what he called a new architecture of American social and political practice. Aspiring for a community beyond the United States, that King famously called the beloved community, it was a community that he hoped would be a global one. And so whereas King never gave up speaking about the Declaration and the Constitution, referring to what the founders said what the founders did when they dug those deep wells of democracy in writing those documents, while King would continue to use those phrases and tropes, when it came to concrete measures in the mid to late 60s, those were not intrinsically tied to the traditional iconic expressions of American principles and practices that we find in the Declaration and the Constitution. King admitted that what he thought people needed to produce the beloved community would have to go beyond what the law could reasonably be expected to require. He wrote that the Constitution was not clear with regards to how to bring about this new set of values and what exactly this new architecture would look like. He wasn't specific in his call for new values and new structures, be they economic, and he, of course, was a fierce critic of capitalism, or be they political. He didn't propose any specific constitutional measures, but calling for a new architecture is a call for something radically different than what we already had. Now, where these critiques of King, critiques of America by King differ from Douglass, I think is that they define ultimately equality differently than Douglass. Ultimately, equality for King is what today goes by the word equity, a focus on outcomes and results, rather than merely ensuring what Douglass called a level playing field and a fair chance. In that respect, is King's patriotism or his love of America something that actually goes against or might undermine the original American promise? Does it actually teach Americans to look down on or even hate America simply because gaps remain when you measure aspects of the American dream according to racial categories, whether it be wealth, health, employment, or educational achievement? To the extent that King's message from 64 to his assassination in 68 leads Americans to expect something of their country that the country could not reasonably deliver or did not ever promise, and therefore leads some Americans to conclude that the principles themselves were deficient and that structures that would implement those principles needed to be radically altered. If we take seriously King's criticism of America for the sake of America, its failure, America's failure, according to King, that was that its existing values were insufficient to make available the American dream for every member of its society. To do so, as I say, would require, in King's mind, different political and economic structures for American society. His criticism leads Americans to expect something from equality, from consent, from individual rights, from equal protection of the laws, to expect something from these principles that can only be fulfilled in the end at the individual level, not at the societal level. This, of course, would mean in varying degrees that equal protection is not going to produce equal results. King was not satisfied with this, and that meant he was not satisfied with America. His model of patriotism finds the American founding lacking in significant respects. When Douglas pointed out the gap between American principle and practice, his critique reinforces our understanding and appreciation of the principles of the founding. His appreciation for what America stands for, his patriotism brings out the best in Americans and their political institutions, calling them to live up to those best principles and institutions. Similarly, King's leadership of the modern civil rights movement succeeded, and rightfully so, when it harked back to the words of the Declaration and the Constitution, calling Americans to reclaim the principle of human equality as its lodestar for American political practice. That far we can go. Go as far as Douglas went. It was how I believe America has made its greatest progress for civil and political rights. But insofar as King discerns a deficiency in the American founding that calls for new values, different structures, I think these might actually undermine our devotion to what Americans have held to be true for so long, and that I believe has been the key to our progress. Time to evade your questions. I once gave a talk on Ralph Ellison as part of the introduction, published a couple of edited books on the great author of Invisible Man. But I was introduced as an expert on Lincoln. I didn't get a single question about Ralph Ellison. It's all about Lincoln. I want your questions to be about Douglas and King. Unless I see a student first. They're thinking. Yes, please.
Professor, thank you very much for coming.
Oh, over there.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a terrific juxtaposing between King and Douglas. My question about Frederick Douglass, what do you believe his relationship was with Abraham Lincoln, and how he, before Lincoln was president, when he was thinking about running and a lawyer in Springfield, and after he was president, and what role do you think that Douglas had in persuading Lincoln to do the Emancipation Proclamation, or was that what was the role in that?
Okay, there's a couple of questions in there. There's a whole lecture in there. There are books written about this. I'll try to keep it brief. Douglas, before, during, and after Lincoln's presidency, was a fierce critic of Lincoln, especially before and during. He was among the loyal opposition. I'll take your second question first. Lincoln famously kept his own counsel. There was very little that anybody else outside of Lincoln, including his wife Mary, there was very little that anyone outside of Lincoln himself could do to move him to go any quicker on any action. But once Lincoln decided to do something, he was resolute about doing it. Emancipation was arguably the most difficult policy that he came up with during his presidency, not just in terms of what it would accomplish, because of course it didn't free all the slaves, but the timing of it, the repercussions of it in terms of especially loyal free states, loyal slave states as they were called at the time, especially Kentucky and Missouri. Douglas met with Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation to argue for equal pay for black soldiers. He met with Lincoln a year later in the summer when Lincoln did not believe he was going to be reelected. It wasn't until the telegram from Sherman the first week of September, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," did it look like the tide was going to shift in terms of the vote. And what Lincoln told Douglas and tried to recruit Douglas to do was essentially John Brown raids into the South because Lincoln was disappointed that not as many enslaved blacks in rebel-held territory and states had come across Union lines into the Navy after January 1st, 1863. So he wanted Douglas to get as many enslaved black people across Union lines before he gave up the presidency to McClellan. Because he says when McClellan becomes president March 4th, 1865, guess what's going out the window? The Emancipation Proclamation. I guess that's all I'll say about that. Generally speaking, the biggest difference between Douglas and Lincoln was the difference between being an abolitionist and being what I would call generally anti-slavery. You could be anti-slavery without being an abolitionist. Abolitionists had a reputation. I mentioned William Lloyd Garrison. There was a guy, the thing about Garrison, you always knew where you stood with that guy. Okay? This is the guy who called the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell and a synagogue of Satan. By the way, all verses from the Bible. 2 from Isaiah, the synagogue one I think is in Revelation. I think you can quote me on that. Abolitionists had the reputation of being fanatics. Garrison, I think it was in 1854 in Massachusetts, burned a copy of the Constitution in public. You don't invite people like that to your parties, okay? Because abolitionism, at least some in the abolition movement believe that justice should be done though the heavens fall. A lot of anti-slavery people said, look, we can't have that kind of attitude. The Constitution is the very thing. Those protections are precisely what black Americans need. You can't be frivolous or flippant about that fundamental rule of law. And so for Lincoln, he wasn't fast enough for Douglas on the abolition front. This is all, easy to find in terms of Douglas's speeches. In terms of him watching Lincoln's career, anticipating what Lincoln would do before his first inaugural, after the first inaugural, which Douglas thought was lame because he didn't sign an Emancipation Proclamation on day one. But in 1876, he famously gave, I think one of his top 3 or 5 speeches, he famously gave this oration to Abraham Lincoln in April of 1876, where he said, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln was slow, tardy, dull, and indifferent. But viewed from the position of a statesman, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. In other words, even Douglas the abolitionist, in a speech where he called Lincoln preeminently the white man's president, in that speech, Douglas walks us through his own journey as an abolitionist to finally realizing, dang, as a president, Lincoln had to act like a statesman. He had to marshal the consent of well-meaning political white people. They were the majority. And so to get anywhere, Lincoln had to have their support. And therefore, he pushed as fast as a statesman could to marshal majority sentiment on behalf of as much justice as that sentiment would desire. Sorry, I didn't see you at the mic. I would have been less prolific.
No,
go ahead, please.
Because I'm trying to see how I can phrase. I have a lot of things going through my head. But the last statement you made was, I believe, that you agreed with Douglas more than King.
Yes, ma'am.
And I would like you to expand on that, and then maybe I'll have another question.
Perfect.
And I'm kind of in the middle of, by the way, John Meacham's book, And There Was Light.
Yes, excellent book.
It is unbelievable.
I'll say something really quick. You want to sit in this chair while I answer?
Okay.
Let me say a product plug, and I don't know Mr. Meacham. I met him one time. I know this is being taped, but I honestly did not want to like that book because he hasn't studied Lincoln for most of his adult career as I have, and I was like, no, there's no way he's going to say cool stuff about Lincoln. It's a good book. It's a good book. My short synopsis, and I'm not stalling. My short synopsis of John Meacham's book is, it's essentially an and I mean this word. It's an evangelistic track for Lincoln. If you know what a typical evangelistic track, guys don't know, some of you know phone booths, people used to leave these tracks. Yeah. So in reading, just to restate what she said, in reading Meacham's book, y'all came out here to hear me review Meacham's book, right? You were seeing, and what Meacham does a good job doing, an excellent job, and he's a way better writer than I am. By the way, he's a way better author than any of you, too. He does a great job of showing where Lincoln wanted to go, but who he had to carry along with him to get there. Okay? So what was your question again? I know what your question is. What is it about Douglas that I like better than King, or where does King fall short? At the end of the day, it's King simply was not satisfied with equal protection under the law. Do blacks deserve it? Yeah. Are you American? End of story. Okay. That was in the story for Douglas. If we could get that, equality under the law, okay, a true a level playing field and a fair chance. They didn't use the word equal opportunity back then. They used words like opportunity and fair chance. If you could do that, Douglas blacks are going to succeed and fall in the same way white people succeed and fall. Newsflash, right? But let's get that level playing field. Because that level playing field for King remained unlevel, not because of laws, but because of slavery. I left out a chunk of my speech where I go into detail in his 1967 book. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community. Chapter 4, the Negro, what he calls, I think, the Negro Dilemma. That was the locution of the day, Negro, the Black American's Dilemma. And in that chapter, and actually earlier as well, King believes that over 300 years of the enslavement of black Americans affects blacks who were never enslaved. What we call the legacy effects of slavery, and I guess you could add racial segregation. King, he's emphatic about this. that because of that, especially the black male, he focused on the black man, head of the household, husband, all that. He said, in a sense, that the black man had been emasculated by that. And because of that, his psyche, Greek transliteration for soul, right? Because of that, the black soul had been disfigured, and it would not be enough simply to say, affirm your manhood, as he said. As he put it, your sense of somebodiness. You gotta, look, I can't do that for you, you can't do that for me. You gotta summon that up. But that for him, Douglas was like, yes! Anachronistic, but Douglas would say yes to that. That wasn't enough for King. It had to be seconded, and he was explicit about this. 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act, he said there has to be massive federal programs. He called for 2 in particular. A guaranteed national income, a floor below which no American should fall. In other words, produce economic security, and he'll go places. That was King's thinking about the black American psyche. He also included poor whites, but I'll leave them out for a second. So guaranteed national income, today goes UBI, Universal Basic Income, and then what he called a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. That was not just for black people. He also thought poor whites were kind of collateral damage of especially black slavery. And what's remarkable about this is that King said, it's not just that federal aid would have this effect internally. King believed it would almost immediately have an impact on the souls of black folk, to quote Du Bois. And so he had an understanding, a view of, to quote Du Bois, the souls of black folk, that I believe was markedly different, or at least somewhat different than Douglas. Douglas thought it was enough to get those protections in place. Of course, that never happened, certainly not in Douglas's life. But he thought it was enough to get those protections in place and then say, all right, you know you're not going to move the goalposts? The laws are going to be applicable to everybody the same way across the board? Let's go. Now we know what to do. Education, industry, show up to work on time. Right? Oh, no closed union shops anymore? Promise? Right? These happened all the way until 1960s, early 70s. Nixon had to start breaking those up. Electrician unions in Philadelphia, something to that effect. So I think it's this understanding. This is why I focus so much on character. I think they had somewhat different, and I say somewhat, but this is a profound, I think, different understanding of the souls of human beings, and a portion of them black folk. And I think Douglas would argue that that undermines our most basic equality as human beings, right? Our birthright as human beings. Go ahead. You said you were going to have a follow-up, so I'll give you that.
I do now. How do we get, since you're saying if we just get those rights?
I'll repeat the question. If we get those rights, I said I'll repeat your question.
If we get those rights, how do we make up for 300 years of not having anything? Because if you look at today, equality, we don't have it. Black people do not have savings. They don't have job security, many of them. Affirmative action is gone.
It's honest, we'll see.
And I see, even today, less diversity. So how do we, my question is, how do we move from being slaves, since I'm the great-granddaughter of Jesse Robertson, who was a slave. So how do we move from that? Watching my parents work their behinds off.
Yeah.
And not get anywhere, not even in education.
I would say, I don't know if you're familiar with this new book by Jonathan, I don't know how to pronounce his name, it's Eig. Jonathan Eig, massive new biography of Martin Luther King Jr., All the people who should know are claiming it is the biography to read on King now, because recordings of King's father, of an autobiography that he was going to write that he never got around to writing, those recordings have become available. He says he has looked at hundreds of, again, previously written notes, documents, secretary of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that King was the president of for a while. In other words, a huge archive of materials have become available recently to fill out a lot that we did not know about King. Why do I bring this up? How are we going to get there? We're going to get there the way King got there. King was 2 generations away from slavery. Okay? His grandfather, not a great model. But his father, like your forebears, worked his tail off. Got married, both educated themselves, and then went to college. He went to Morehouse, failed his first exam. This is King's dad, Daddy King, not King himself, who eventually went to Morehouse. Mother, I believe, went to Spelman, black male university, black female university. She was way more educated than Daddy King was. In other words, look what I'm pointing out. King's parents were one generation away from enslavement. What was Daddy King able to do within a generation? Become the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, a place that was financially in shambles, and turned it into not just a vibrant 2,500 member black Baptist church and his primo property in what they called Sweet Auburn. He basically, to be the head of a black Baptist church in that day, you had to be not just a pastor, but a full-time and a half social worker. That's what he in Alberta did, okay? One generation, one, from slavery. What were they able to provide? ML, Michael, became Marvin, became Martin Luther. What were they able to provide? Martin Luther King, his brother, his sister, stable family, encouragement for education. King went to Morehouse, very young. He just kind of made, every other year he was skipping a grade growing up. I think he was Morehouse when he was 16. It's ridiculous, okay? I said that I left out a chunk of my speech where he talks about the burden of color in America. He called it color shock. He makes this remarkable statement very early in chapter 4. Where do we go from here? Chaos or Community, where King said, he said this about every black American, that what characterizes their life, one word, pain. What characterizes the life of every black American was pain. And I thought to myself, did that characterize your life, King? No, I said to myself as I'm reading, King, write this and publish this. I don't know if it's true. But his claim is that's true about every black person. And I go, I'll arguendo, for the sake of argument, I'll say, okay, fine, King. Your life has been dominated by pain. Did that hold you back? The racial discrimination that he faced, absolutely unjust, undeserved, but it didn't hold him back from getting that education, keeping his hands to himself for the most part. Don't ask me to follow up on that. And becoming the civil rights figure that we know. Now, it's kind of unfair, I'll have to admit, to pick guys like Douglass and King. These guys are, in a way, kind of superhuman, right? But for me, they show at the macro level precisely what's possible, to at least some extent, for those who put their mind to it, and are provided, as I put it, for King, it was within 2 generations removed from enslavement. key things culturally that should be in place that will enable someone who intends on making something of herself, being able to pull that off. And that's true. My parents, quick auto, I just saw you. I'll stall a little longer. My parents hailed from the Dominican Republic, República Dominicana. They came over here in 1962. Dad didn't graduate elementary school. Mom didn't graduate high school. They came over here, the classic don't know any English sort of thing. They knew my future, and the future of my 4 siblings was in America. It wasn't going back to the DR, right? That was dirt, poor poverty. So relatively uneducated parents, but knew the value of education. Grew up in a pretty strong Catholic household, although my dad went to the swap meet. My mom took us to church. Dad went on Easter and Christmas. It's a Catholic thing. Anyway, they only had 2 expectations of me and my sisters and brother. Did you do your homework? And who are you hanging out with today? Who are my friends? And have you done your homework? Character and mind. That's my answer to your question.
I'm going to say this, then I'm going to shut up. As a person who's been there and is still there, some of us make it. I did in my family. I and my brother. We did. 2 other siblings did not. Some of us make it, and that's where my problem. Most of African Americans, without that, just, something that gets you through. And that's where I am. Not enough of us are doing that.
Okay. My parting comment on that, as you said, some of us make it, some don't. I think you see that variety in every human family, every American family. You see that variety in my family. Even my siblings are all successful in their own right, but if you were to measure wealth, educational achievement, all that kind of stuff, who's won an Emmy? Short answer, not I. I think you see that diversity throughout all families. So my point is that I think that diversity, you're going to see that diversity, especially when the playing field's equal. Okay, anyway, sorry. Please.
So Martin Luther King's approach to civil rights was nonviolence.
Yes.
And Douglas' approach might have been a different approach. What do you think the comparison between the nonviolence approach that Martin Luther King proposed and Douglas, who seems to be more aligned with maybe John Brown and some other more aggressive abolitionists?
Okay, did everybody get that? Could you guys hear that? The difference between Frederick Douglass and King in terms of the means to perhaps a common end. King said, you don't get to love through hate. You don't get to the beloved community by violence, by hating your enemy. And to his dying day, he thought nonviolent protest and a subset of that, civil disobedience. Not all people in favor of nonviolent protest are in favor of civil disobedience. King articulated that in the letter from Birmingham jail. Douglas, for a while, if you will, followed the pacifist William Lloyd Garrison. That was the school among abolitionists known as moral suasion. That all you could do to get rid of slavery was to speak the truth about its injustice and pray that the conviction of the Holy Spirit of God would come upon slaveholders to recognize what they were doing was wrong and to give up their ways. Regardless of whether John Brown had that impact or not, a few did that. But needless to say, not many. When Douglas came back from the UK in 1847, he co-edited a newspaper called the North Star with another black political activist named Martin Delany. And in the process of editing that newspaper, Douglas kept reading. And he did what most readers do, is he weighed the opinions that he had had before and sifted them, considered them in light of other opinions. And came to the conclusion, you know what? I don't know about this moral suasion stuff. It is necessary, but not sufficient. I think we need to be not just moral suasionists, but we need to be political abolitionists. We need to do what Garrison refused to do, which is to enter the political arena and get the government to do right. Douglas changed his mind about the Constitution. Instead of arguing, as Garrison had argued, and many abolitionists of that school, that the Constitution was pro-slavery, by about 1850, Douglas, in fact, he published a short statement called Change of Opinion, where he's like, you know what, I've been rethinking this. I've been reading guys like Gerrit Smith, Lysander Spooner, Wendell Phillips. I think we've been making it easier for these Southern slaveholders to claim the Constitution is theirs. No! Where in the preamble? In fact, where in any of the four corners of that document do we ever see the word slave or slavery? Nowhere. Where is race mentioned? Nowhere. So Douglas became persuaded, and he famously, in his most famous speech, what to the slave is the 4th of July, July 5th, 1852, deservedly his most famous speech. He basically comes out and says, I'm no longer a Garrisonian, even though he ends with a poem by Garrison. He comes out and makes the argument for a pro-liberty constitution. Okay? So, where is he? Once Douglas made that turn, that pivot to the pro-liberty, glorious liberty document, Constitution, Douglas, for the most part, and I'll get to the other part in a second, Douglas, for the most part, argued for the rule of law, argued for the Constitution, was not going to do things the John Brown way. In fact, I said that he had to flee the country when his autobiography came out. He had to make himself scarce as well when John Brown was apprehended, because John Brown had met with Douglas to try to get him on board of that suicide mission, and Douglas wasn't going to do that. So for the most part, Douglas was not, I would not put him in the camp of the John Brown folks, although he was closer to Brown than he was to Lincoln, except he, for the most part, held on to the Constitution. Now, in what way didn't he do this? Douglas published an editorial called, Is It Right and Just to Kill a Kidnapper? And by kidnapper, he meant anyone who aided and abetted the apprehension of what were known at the time as fugitive slaves who had escaped. In that essay, not only on principle, but in practice, Douglas made the argument that it would be legitimate to kill someone, either a federal marshal or someone deputized to help the marshal to apprehend an escaped slave. Douglas condoned the killing, in this particular case in Boston, of someone who was deputized to help apprehend an escaped slave. So that fiery anti-rule of law part of Douglas, it was there. But most of the time, you got the Constitution as the glorious liberty document, that the Constitution, equal protection under the law, these are precisely the things that blacks in America desperately needed. Remember, if you've read, show of hands, be honest, how many of you have read the letter from Birmingham jail? Oh, I don't know about you right-wingers. I'm sorry, on the stage, it's stage right, stage left, so you're right-wingers today. I don't care. You guys have heard of the letter from Birmingham jail? What's wrong with you guys? Okay, a few of you are like, okay, now I'm admit it. Okay. King was a great rhetorician, and what great rhetoricians do is they don't set up straw men, they set up the strongest arguments against their position and proceed to knock them down. Now I'll leave it to you to judge whether he knocked down the opposition. But he admitted in a letter from a Birmingham jail that it was problematic to argue, not for nonviolence, but for civil disobedience. Because what had happened, that essay was published in 1963. What happened when that unanimous Supreme Court decision that desegregated public schools K through 12 was announced on May 17th, 1954? Everybody said, okay, we have to desegregate schools. 2 words, Little Rock. Took 3 years. And the 101st Airborne to escort 9 black seniors to the public school in the capital of Arkansas. Okay? In other words, when that decision was issued in Virginia, which is my state, Commonwealth now, in Virginia, public authorities declared massive resistance. They were civil disobedient. They chose a Supreme Court decision that they thought was unconstitutional. Where in the Constitution does it talk about education? How do they get off telling us what to do at the national level, what we're supposed to do at the local level? Where do they get off? So you know what they did with public schools in Virginia? Closed them and found ways to fund private schools for white kids. What did black kids do? Either didn't go to school or got sent to relatives in Maryland or other neighboring states. What's my point? King admitted in the letter from Birmingham jail, my exhortation to followers that they disobey a particular law to call attention to the injustice of it so that it could be redressed. Am I not giving the same argument for the massive resistors? Okay? Anyway, you got that for free. Do we have?
I think we're at time.
We're at time? Man, I didn't stall enough. I should have just answered one question.
To close things down. Thank you all again for coming out here. Anyone interested in the kind of education that undergirds our approach to civic discourse, we hope you'll pick up information on SCETL's courses, our major, our minor, our certificate program, and our new certificate program in PPE, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. We hope to see you next month at the next CDP event, February 23rd and 24th, for our annual conference. And my thanks to all of our wonderful staff, particularly Janelle Nassif, Emma Hall, and Paul Willett, who helped with the arrangements of making this such a success. If you've enjoyed the conversation, look for our school's podcast, Keeping It Civil, on iTunes and other platforms, hosted by Henry Thompson of the School of Politics and Global Studies here at Arizona State. And again, thank you for coming out, and please join me in thanking our guest for modeling civil discourse, Lucas Morel.